So why does Biden copy China? It's an interesting title, but I'm going to talk here about infrastructure, about the jobs plan. I'm going to talk about what Biden wants to do to revitalize the economy and how he's dealing with the G7 in making that happen and competing with China on the Belt and Road and other things. And this is really about comparing the American dream with the Chinese dream. So welcome to this week's Pascal's China Lens on why Biden is starting to copy China. Why is Biden starting to copy China is the question I'm going to try and answer in this week's Pascal's China Lens. If you haven't subscribed yet to Pascal's China Lens, there's a subscribe button here. You can just click it and follow all my movies on China and innovation. Now back to Biden. Why is he starting to do this? And this is a story about infrastructure and about planning. Now, if we go back to 2014, Joe Biden gave a big speech to many people in Colorado Springs, and he was telling to everyone that China, and it's true, he said, is graduating 6 to 8 times as many scientists and engineers as we have, as the US has. And if you look at 2018, the numbers is like 560,000 engineers, STEM graduates in the US, and it was 4.666 million coming from China, so almost 10 times as much. So there's so many engineers coming from China. But then he added something, and this is really remarkable. He said, but I challenge you, he said that to all the people, name me one innovative project, one innovative change, and one innovative product that has come out of China. So he said, even though they have all these engineers and scientists in China, they can't innovate. That's the message. And for me, this was mind-boggling. This is like 2014, 7 years ago today. I could instantly give you 4 examples. Think about Huawei in 2014, and these are articles I found online from 2014. Huawei was already the biggest patent applier in the world. They were already leading with 4G, 5G, definitely. If you look at Tencent, Facebook started to copy it, or look at many people were saying Facebook should start to copy and learn from Tencent's WeChat because they already had payment, they already had like the whole real society that you could use WeChat, like order a taxi or order food. That was 2014. Things like BYD, they already had electrical vehicles, buses that were the most advanced in the world. This is 2014. BGI, the biggest genome sequencing company in the world. And these are just 4 companies based in Shenzhen. So Shenzhen wasn't the most innovative place back then. It was actually Beijing. And so you wonder, how is it possible that someone like Joe Biden, the second in command under Obama at that time, had no clue? Or maybe he didn't want to tell the world. But this is important because these words that the vice president and now the president is telling is what everybody starts believing. But it wasn't true back. Now, is it true today? Let's go into that detail. Well, what happened is just a month ago, at the 100 days of his presidency, Joe Biden gave a speech at the State of the Union. This was end of April. And he gave a speech to all the senators. There weren't too many because it was still COVID-19 period, so people had to have their distance. But he gave a speech, a very long speech, explaining everything about his plans and his future. Now, one of the things he said is that in the next 10 years, there's going to be more change than has happened over the past 50 years. And a lot of it has to do with AI and new technologies and breakthrough innovations that has come up, biotech and so on, that is really changing everything. And he's saying clearly, we're falling behind the competition with the rest of the world. And this is symbolic. If you compare 2014 with 2021, in 7 years' time, his story is like China cannot innovate, the world outside of the Western world cannot innovate, and now we're falling behind of the competition. Because he was aiming at China. We saw that in other things that he said. He said, America's moving, but we can't stop now. He said, we're in competition with China and other countries to win the 21st century. We're at a great inflection point in history. And so he realizes that today, everything's going to change, and he who owns the next 10 years might become the superpower in the world, which today America is. And so very clearly, Biden was warning every American that China is starting to eat their lunch. I mean, it's no secret. I mean, Reuters was debating, talking about it. Everybody was talking about it. This is the story that he's telling. So how in 7 years' time did he change completely his mind? Well, it's because China did things in 7 years that America did not do. And he went on with this State of the Union. He went on with his speech. But one point in his speech was very symbolic. Because that was a point where Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi just stood up, and every senator stood up, gave him a standing ovation, talking about China. They really applauded, and they really wanted to show this is the way to go. So what is it that he said? Well, he said something very interesting. He said, there's simply no reason why the blades for wind turbines can't be built in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing. No reason, none, no reason whatsoever. That was the story. And he went on and he said, so folks, Americans, there's no reason why American workers can't lead the world in production of electrical vehicles and batteries. There's no reason. He sees no reason. You have the capacity. America has the capacity. You have the best and brightest people in the world. So if anybody can do it, then we should be able to do it. Why is China building these wind turbines, and why is China building the EVs, and why is China building the batteries? There's no reason. Of course, there's many reasons, and the main reason is the investment in the infrastructure that China did, the plan that they did. It's also, I mean, the windmills never were built in Beijing, but regardless of that small detail, the reality is that there's a reason why China has been building all these things. And he knows that reason. He just claims there is no reason. And why is he knowing that reason? Because that's what he's putting in his jobs plan. That's what he really told all Americans, this is what we need to do. And it's a copy almost of the blueprint of China from the last 8 years, of course, adapted to the American market and American situation. But this Build Back Better strategy or plan that he has really talks about building infrastructure in order to enable the economy to grow again and stay the superpower that they are today. He's not saying it in these words, but that is really what's behind. Now, of course, they have the brightest people in the world, but so does China, because there's smart people everywhere in the world. It's just that China has more smart people graduating as an engineer and scientist because there are just 8 times as many graduating. It's as simple as that. It's not about being brighter or not bright. It's about quantity, because a lot of smart people together can do a lot of smart things. Now, the interesting thing is that his job plan is in 4 different categories. And I want to show this and show that his $2.2 trillion investment plan that he has, or had, because that is what he proposed a couple of months ago, is really about changing the whole infrastructure of America to make sure that America could be great again. I didn't want to use that word from Trump, but that's basically what he's saying. Now, he's going to do that in 4 different areas. It's about R&D, it's about manufacturing, so he wants to get more innovation out of America, which of course a lot to do with the chip industry, semiconductors, but also 5G, electrical vehicles, all these things that really will change, and related of course to sustainability and new energy or renewable energy. So this is all great stuff. And when you look at R&D, America actually has been falling back related to China, more on the development side than on the research side. But now he wants to catch up again. Almost $600 billion. Then there's the care economy, which is a big issue in America. The elderly care is really tumbling. I mean, there's a lot of problems, and so a lot of people don't have the care that they should have, specifically in the poor areas. So he wants to elevate that. That's a very noble and great thing and needed investment. And then there's the home infrastructure. And we don't always realize, when we think about America and this great country, how poor some of the rural areas are. We're talking about no broadband. I mean, no internet. We're talking about water. We're talking about electricity challenges. But most important is actually affordable houses. A lot of people just can't afford a house. So they have to rent somewhere cheaper because there's no possibility. I'm not saying China doesn't have that problem, but the reality is this is a huge issue for America too. And then the biggest one is infrastructure. because they've never invested much into it over the past decade. It was all about putting the money into consumption, putting the money into the economy and the service industry, but the infrastructure itself actually started really crumbling. And so this, if you look, or you actually write on the roads in America, I mean, there's a lot of potholes, there's a lot of problems. Now, I don't want to say there's a huge problem, but actually there is. The reality is that if you compare with Chinese roads, you compare with Chinese infrastructure, it really is as if you're going back in time. And so America needs to do something about that. And that's their plan, 2.2 trillion US dollars. Now, what is China doing? Why am I claiming that Biden is actually looking at China to do this? Well, if you just look at the last 12 years, since the Olympics, China has really created an enormous infrastructure. It started in 2008 with the high-speed trains, and what you could see is that in just 12 years' time, China has built more than 30,000 kilometers in high-speed train, a lot of it 30 meters above ground. I mean, it's an impressive network, but it also made China smaller and more efficient. And then there's the normal railroads. There's 120,000 kilometers, of which more than 20,000 was built just in the last 5 years. Then there are high-speed or expressways. There's 130,000 kilometers there, with more than 30,000 being built over the past 5 years. I mean, this is like crazy. I mean, if you live in China, you really see the difference. Airports, the most advanced airports, subways. Shanghai has 22 subway lines. I mean, there's no comparison with America. Now, I don't want to say they're doing good and the other is doing bad. I'm just saying Joe Biden has really a lot of work ahead of him. And changing the infrastructure is the highest priority at this stage. Because in China, there's a Chinese saying that goes, Yao xiangfu, xian xiulu. And this is a saying that's hundreds of years old. And it means if you want to become rich and wealthy, you first have to repair your road. So I think this saying that is so old in China is very applicable to the American situation. So repair your roads first, repair the infrastructure. And this is what Biden is planning to do. But this is what China did over the past decade. Now, if we look at China, since 2015, there's a lot that changed. Because there it was not just building roads and concrete everywhere, it was also about building smart. And so there's a few things that happened since 2015. And one of them is the Made in China 2025 plan, which was like this 10-year plan to focus on innovation in 10 different industries. And if you look at what America is doing in their focus now, there's very similar 10 industries. It's about AI, it's about biotech, it's about semiconductors, it's about robotics, it's about very similar industries. And then there's the China Standard 2035, so a little bit longer, to set standards for the world. And the West, specifically America, is fighting back against these Chinese standards, or that means that America wants to set their standards too. So we're seeing this happening. And just for that creation of that new economy, that new infrastructure, those new roads, those new digital roads, you could say today, China has pledged 1.6 trillion US dollars in the next 5-year plan. So compared to the 2.2 trillion from the US, it's still less, you could say. But there is a difference. And one difference is that so far Biden seems to be able to get a commitment for about 20% of that 2.2 trillion. That means about 400 to 500 billion. That's not even 1/3 of what China's going to invest. And then on top of that, Chinese local governments and cities are planning to invest 5 trillion US dollars into their local cities in all these 4 same things that Biden is doing, into R&D manufacturing, to new science hubs, into the care economy, very important these days. I made this video about aging population and also about healthcare. You can look at those 2 videos to understand how this is transforming now. But there's a lot of attention on becoming more healthy as a society. And then there's the home infrastructure and the public infrastructure. And it's very clear that China's putting a lot of investment into not just building roads and buildings and bridges and so on, but also 5G, IoT, satellite communication, lots of things like smart cities. So there's a lot of digital going in there. And that is because they want to become a smart infrastructure, not just an infrastructure. And it has to be sustainable as well, which means there's a lot to do about renewable energy. And so all these things together, it looks as if China's already at the place where America should be or could be in a decade if they do the investment. And so that's kind of weird. But this is the reality. But Biden is looking at China, maybe because it worked for them, it could work for America. Now, if we think about the fact that he doesn't really get all his money, only like 500 billion instead of 2.2 trillion right now, one of the things he did just last week was go to Europe. Try to find allies. And this was part of his promise in his election campaign, like, I'm going to work with all the allies in the world and not just like Trump. I'm not going to break everything. I'm going to work with Europe. I'm going to work with Australia, with Canada, with everybody. And that's what he's doing. So last week he went to England, and he there, at that point, he met all these leaders from the G7. And the G7 is the 7, officially, what we hear on the news always, is it's the 7 richest or most developed, wealthy countries in the world. And besides America, there's a lot of countries like Italy, there's France, there's Germany, there's UK, Japan, and Canada. So these are the 7 countries that was established in 1975, a long time ago, really in the concept of globalization. And this has aided the world a lot in becoming almost a hyper-globalized environment. But does this have still the same meaning today? Now, his goal was to get money from these other countries to do the other infrastructure plan, which is a global one. But when we look at the G7, and we look at the 9 most richest or the highest GDP countries in the world, there's also China and India in there. And somehow they're not part of the G7. And the reason they're not part of the G7, specifically China, is because now they say this is about liberal democracies. Agreed. But does it make sense that 2 of the biggest economies in the world are not deciding together with the others on global matters? That is a question to be asked. If you look at China and India together, their GDP is bigger than the G7 if you take out America. If you just take the other 6 members, it's bigger. In purchasing power parity, actually China and India have 80% of the G7 in purchasing power parity. So not having them in there makes no sense in this global world. But that is how it is. So China doesn't really like this G7 because they feel they're excluded, and India is also excluded. They were invited on the table just to have some side discussions, but they weren't part of the decision takers. And China's looking at this much more as kind of like going back 120 years, 1901, where the same countries, the alliances of 7 countries, were actually deciding on what to do with China. Basically, they stood together to safeguard their presence into China. And for China, it really starts making sense that these things is happening again. This is about imperialism. Now, I'm not saying China's right. I'm not saying the G7 is right. What I'm saying is that the vision or the lens that China now has on the G7 is really about this doesn't matter anymore because they don't decide the future of the world anymore. But everywhere in the West, we've been hearing all these stories from the G7 because we still believe, most of us, that they have the power to change everything. Now, what are they changing? Well, one of the things they've looked at is China this time. China was the top of the agenda on everything they discussed almost. And they see China as a strategic rival, a competitor. Most of the G7, specifically America, but also Canada and others. And they look specifically at the Belt and Road Initiative. That's like $770 billion that China has invested over the past 7 years, 8 years since 2013, into many, many countries around the world. The Belt and Road, or the New Silk Road as many call it. And this is about 50% is invested in Asia, East and West Asia. And then there's like 21% invested in Africa and 14% in the Middle East. And so the rest is going to Europe and Latin America. But you see that China has invested hundreds of billions of dollars over the past 7 years in many countries around the world. And so there are a lot of people talking about this debt trap and this forced investments that basically gives a soft power to China. And so the G7 wanted to have a response to that. Same when it comes to the vaccine diplomacy and the mass diplomacy. And so China wants friends. Now, it's everywhere the same. America also wants friends. That's why they went to the G7 and tried to do things together. But China also needs friends. And so they give They make friends because people actually in Africa and Middle East and in Latin America, some of these countries are pretty happy to get vaccines or to get solved some of their problems like infrastructure, which the West hasn't been doing much or enough in the past 10 years. And so this is kind of like the tension that is happening. And so China has clearly been very aggressive on trying to help the world in order, of course, in the future to help itself. And by doing that, also help the local population. There's another thing, there's something about safety. I mean, the military in China has really increased in investment like never before. It's about $260 billion or almost $300 billion every year. Still a third of what the US spends on military, but that's a lot of money. And so China is becoming a military rival on top. And so this is a big concern for the West. And then you have, of course, the ideology difference, the democracy versus the authoritarian regime of China, the Communist Party. And so this is something that is also a big concern, because the West really has wanted, within globalization, to promote democracy everywhere in the world. Not with a lot of success always, but that has always been their goal, still is today. And so what is happening? What's happening is that at the G7, they decided to invest hundreds of billions of dollars, just like the Belt and Road Initiative, in the rest of the world to help these poor countries to build an infrastructure, to give them a choice. Do you want the money from the US or do you want the money from China? And so this is interesting because now it's about values and about conditions. And so the question is, will it be successful? China doesn't believe that. We'll see what it happens. The other question I have, how are these countries going to spend these hundreds of billions of dollars, or where are they going to get them? It's not clear. But for China, the $1.6 trillion, that is being decided. That's a plan. That is going to get executed. When it comes to vaccines, China has already given 350 million vaccines to the rest of the world. They should be getting to 1 billion outside of China by the end of this year. And so by coincidence, Biden, together with the G7, decided that they will also donate 1 billion vaccines. It seems to be like the same number. We're getting in same number land. And so for me, that's why I say Biden and the G7, they're starting to copy China, because they're looking at this blueprint. And then military-wise, very clear, was the meeting with Biden and NATO. Now suddenly, China is part of the rivals. Before it was always the Russia and Soviet Union before. The Cold War mentality is coming back. And now Russia is not the enemy anymore, because before it was the border with Europe, that was the challenge. China has no border with Europe, but now China's everywhere. They're in space and in the Arctic, they're in cyber attacks. I mean, so yes, China's there. And so suddenly China became on the other side. What that means is that we're getting into a decoupling. We're getting into a bipolar world. And that is very, very dangerous. We could get into a splinter net. We could get into a lot of things that basically define who's friends with who and who is actually working and partnering with who. But the interesting thing that I think is that Joe Biden has really set the tone to unite everyone. Very different from Trump. Trump was all about make America great again. This is about us. He killed a lot of global deals and multilateral deals, but Biden, he wants these multilateral deals. He wants these partnerships, these alliances. But the interesting thing is he's getting them because of China. China is uniting the West. And they're uniting America within America, Republicans and Democrats. It's the first time that actually they agree on pretty much everything when it concerns China. Same in Europe. The G7, if it wouldn't be for the China threat, they probably wouldn't agree on so many aspects. Specifically because Trump last time at the G7 didn't really make a great job. And that the European Union and NATO, I mean, he was almost killed NATO. So somehow China is the trigger to unite people in the West. And I find that paradoxical, because I think we should be united in the West, not because of China, but because we have similar values, similar ideas, and similar goals. And although we talk about it, without China, I'm not so sure that we would be so united. Something to think about. Now, if we look at China and why they actually invested so much, Beijing invested so much inside China in the infrastructure, but also with the Belt and Road outside China, there's four main reasons in my view. The first one has to do with fear. And I think that's very, very clear. In China, I mean, for centuries, think about the Great Wall of China, they've always been worried about either invasions or getting like that a lot of countries are trying to enclose it or control it. We've seen it 120, 150 years ago. But it's also something to do with cutting off China from the supply chain today. And Trump made it very obvious. I mean, they have all the reasons. It's justified to have fear. Why? Because if America stops sending silicon and they stop sending high tech, like we're seeing now, with the new list of 60 countries, 60 companies in China that cannot get technology from the US, well, it's very clear that China doesn't want this dependency, and so they want to be self-reliant as much as possible. This is about fear. The other thing is about caring for the country. And this is something that is thousands of years old. I mean, this starts with Confucianism. They really care about people. And when I'm talking about people, I'm talking about this respect between people and this rule-based environment which they have, or regulation-based environment, so everybody stays in harmony and there's no chaos in the country. Very important that the people on the bottom actually feel they're part of the growth. And with communism, of course, I don't need to explain that that is important too. So the caring for population is a story that we don't hear enough from China, but I think maybe one of the main drivers why China is being so much investing into the infrastructure in its country. The other thing is leadership, and that's also for centuries old. All the emperors, the dynasties, I mean, and today also China likes great leaders, and of course today that's Xi Jinping. And he has a lot of weight on his shoulders. I mean, we don't talk about that too much, but they expect a lot from this leadership. And so that's why they want to show this leadership through the infrastructure, through the investment. You think about that story about you have to build a road or repair your road to get rich. Well, that's what China's leadership is doing. And ultimately, China has a dream. It's called the Chinese Dream, 2049. That's when the People's Republic of China will be 100 years old. And that Chinese dream is really about building a modern socialist country by 2049. And a modern socialist country is about a number of things. It's about a prosperous and strong country. But they're also talking about a democratic and culturally adapted or advanced country, which is kind of weird to put democratic into these goals. But democracy in China is a little bit different meaning than in the West. But this is what they want, and it's actually more for the people than actually by the people. So they want to do good for the people, think about the caring, not just be elected by the people. And so this is about democracy. But if you think about the cultural adaptability or advancement, this is about elevating the whole society. And then they want harmony. And that's the most important word of all. And so China aims in the next 30 years to really have a society which is kind of prosperous and more harmonious. And that is the reason why they're investing so much. Now, the question we should ask ourselves, what is Biden doing? What are his motives? Why is he doing this? Is it fear? Is it caring? Is it leadership? Or is there an American dream that they really are looking at? The question I should ask you, maybe you think, you can tell me in the comments which of those four you think is the most important. I think when it's about fear, it's very clear that the fear of America for the past 20 years has been terrorism. And that's why they spend so much on military. Before it used to be the Soviet Union. And today it starts to be China. But there's still a lot of fear in that. Otherwise you don't invest so much into that military apparatus. The other thing is about caring. And Biden said it very clear at the State of the Union at his 100-day speech. He said very clearly that he doesn't want to make the richer rich. He doesn't want to serve the 1% wealthy in America. He wants to serve the middle class. He wants to serve the poor people and help them build the country again. And so this is a very noble task that he has. And I think it's the right message to bring to America. But then it's about leadership as well. Is that important still? Of course. America is the #1 hegemony in the world. It's the #1 leader in the world. They are protecting the Western world in a way, mostly, specifically with the military, but also with their vision and innovation and lots of things. Great things coming out of America. But they've lost a lot of that edge, and a lot had to do in the Trump era, just last 4 years, where there's been different accent. It was about making America great again, not making the world great again. And so they will have to get that back. And that's what Biden is doing. Does he still have enough time? Does he have enough credibility? Is Europe and the other countries still going to support him as much as they used to before, it's all a question mark. But I hope for him that there's actually still that strong Western bloc to enable the innovation and everything to flourish. And the last thing is the American dream. And many, many years ago, I mean 1969, they set a man on the moon. And JFK really said that this is their American dream, and this happened. And the whole world was watching, and they could see, wow, this is the future. And they've had many American dreams. Think about Silicon Valley, think about everything they've done. Lots of people became very rich in America. And so that American dream is why so many Chinese went to America. They went to America because of the American dream. They could do whatever they want. They could actually develop things, innovate. They could have their dreams. But that is now fading slowly away as well. And somehow Biden's biggest task, in my view, will have to be build a dream again. Because I didn't see that in his speeches. I didn't see that at the G7. No, it was all about better back. It was build back better. That's what he was saying. And build back better means go back in time. It's not going into the future. It's not a dream. It's copy or catch up. And so this is what we always say about China. China's catching up. Well, when it's about infrastructure, I get the feeling it's the West who is catching up. And I think the biggest mistake that the West is making today is not to listen to one of the smartest people in the world, which was Steve Jobs, well, that once said, you can't look at the competition and say you're going to do it better. You have to look at the competition and say you're going to do it differently. And I believe the only way for America, for Europe, for the West to actually stay ahead of China or actually keep their relevance in the world is to do it differently. Not just try to do it better than China. So we should stop copying China. So that's my story about why America, why Biden, why the G7 are starting to copy China when it comes to infrastructure. I believe it is completely valid and completely right to do so. They'll never admit there's a copy, it's their own invention or plan, but the reality is it looks very similar. Now I hope you liked it. I'm going to try and make next week's video a little bit shorter because again it was a long video. I apologize for that. So I hope to see you next week for another episode on Pascal's China Lens.